Apocalypse Zero is the most underrated anime of all time, and that's not really too surprising. It's not an easy show to watch if you have even the slightest weakness of constitution, and that's kind of the theme of the experience. The main character is a hero whose father trained him and his older brother from birth with brutal diligence to inherit the role of an ultimate protector of justice, capable of rescuing the innocent from even the most apocalyptically hellish vision of Earth imaginable. Hell, in the eyes of mangaka Yamaguchi Takayuki, is preposterous to the point of hilarity, but terrifying to the point of hopelessness. After Japan's entire landmass is broken to pieces by earthquakes, nuclear radiation mutates people into Yu-Gi-Oh cards by way of R-rated Garbage Pal Kids. That is to say, S&M-themed giant dick and titty monsters, built by stapling together the most over-the-top metaphors for the core human flaws which have overtaken each one's person. They are vile, self-serving, evil predators, using their powers to treat humans as playthings in the hands of Sid from Toy Story. In spite of looking like a Mad Max hellscape though, Tokyo is still inhabited by regular people who survived into the lawless era, with no idea what to do but continue striving to live as regular a life as they can, while hoping not to fall prey to some demonic creature. It is this uniquely dualistic setting which creates the brilliantly ridiculous central conceit of the show, that the main character is a teenage superhero who comes to school every day in a post-apocalyptic wasteland so that he can protect the innocent children his age from the berserk apostles that are constantly trying to eat them on their way to school. Of course, the idea that the kids would keep coming to school in this situation is completely preposterous, but this is more or less addressed as soon as the school is introduced in the OVA by basically outright stating its metaphorical purpose. In a conversation between the school's principal, who clearly takes his role very seriously, and the twisted teacher who doesn't really give a shit anymore and is just hopelessly going through the motions expecting humanity's eventual demise, the principal rejects the teacher's pessimism, stating that the students represent the potential for humanity's future. So we've got our key factors. The children symbolize the goodness of the human spirit as it is represented within the nature and abilities of completely average high schoolers. The apocalyptic setting is an extreme way of suggesting that young people today are born into a world which is already so badly damaged and full of pain that it's all they can do just to survive. The hero, Kakugo, represents the will of all resolute souls throughout human history to protect and preserve the human spirit, becoming an engine of self-sacrifice with no purpose other than to be as effective as possible in dispatching dangers to human life. The demons represent the twisted elements of human nature which will threaten the innocence and livelihood of the human spirit in everyday life, taken to their furthest extreme. Over the course of this 2-episode OVA from 1996, which was sadly cancelled before it could continue adapting the 11-volume manga that ran from 94 to 96, Kakugo fights 4 different horrible monstrosities. The first is a gigantic, hideous woman who hates seeing other women receiving attention from men, so whenever she sees a couple, she murders the woman, then rapes and eats the man, before sewing his face over her giant nipple. The second monster is a sort of weird giant man-baby creature in vaguely SS-themed fetish gear, who rants about how anything which threatens his individuality must be destroyed. He proclaims that his sense of identity is tied to these giant flowers which eat people, and that destroying these flowers in order to protect human life is an attack on his self-expression. This is not a metaphor, he literally verbally states this, and that's where we need to take a step back and really describe what Apocalypse Zero actually is in the context of how it originally existed, which has been completely missing from most of the discussion of this OVA in Western anime discourse. In Japanese, Apocalypse Zero is known as Kakugo no Susume. Since Kakugo is the name of the main character, Wikipedia sees to translate this as Kakugo's Progress, which I guess is fine in a literal sense, but in the tradition of Japanese manga titles of the era, the title is also a pun, because Kakugo is also a Japanese word that roughly means resolve or resolute. I think if I could have translated the title in a way which best captures how it reflects the themes of the story, I'd have called it Remain Resolute. But the reality of Western anime distribution in the 90s is that they were bringing over things like incomplete, schlocky OVA adaptations of manga that we'd never heard of, which comment on a culture that we barely understand, in the hopes that we'll enjoy them purely on the basis of over-the-top violence and gratuitous sexual content. As such, maintaining purity to the original spirit of the work was secondary to marketing it to the interests of the audience. Apocalypse Zero does sound cool, and it's not like the title has nothing to do with anything. The show is set in an apocalyptic Japan, and the main character dons the Zero suit to go into battle. But this is really more like an excuse in the face of how they actually marketed the thing, literally ripping off the font from the beloved cinematic masterpiece Apocalypse Now. Even just when I tweeted about this OVA today, someone assumed it was a show about the Vietnam War, which it is absolutely not. So the marketing was already working against the reputation the OVA was going to receive in the same way that Ninja Resurrection's branding did to Makai Tensho. I am sympathetic to Media Blaster's marketing tactics, only because I don't know if Apocalypse Zero had any real hope for success in the US outside of appealing to shockhounds, given the level of perspective the average fan had on anime and manga history and Japanese culture in the year 2000, and I know what it was like because I was around at the time. There were academics and older otaku who probably had read the manga in Japanese and already felt about it back then the same way that the Japanese did when it came out and was not only obviously popular, having run for 11 volumes, but was runner-up for the Osamu Tezuka Cultural Prize in 1997. But the direction Western anime fandom was heading in the early 2000s wasn't going to be so warmly receptive to Apocalypse Zero. You see, in the late 80s and early 90s, anime spread through the UK and US largely thanks to dark, edgy, and grown-up, often batshit crazy movies and OVAs which showed them fuck shit like they'd never seen before. The still underappreciated Eroguro masterwork of Ninja Scroll, the thought-provoking contemplative science fiction of Ghost in the Shell, the over-the-top sexual violence and colorful insanity of Urotsuki Doji, and the ultimate glimpse into the haunted social psychology of the Japanese in the atom bomb dropping Akira. In Japan, these were of course hugely popular and influential films as well, but they more would have blended in with the wealth of other amazing stuff that was coming out alongside them. And since all of the good stuff was rippling out to influence tropes and imitations, anything that kind of looked like the stuff that had gotten popular in the West was going to get published there. Once more, to Media Blaster's credit, they did actually start bringing the Apocalypse Zero manga to America in the mid-2000s, releasing 6 of the 11 volumes before canning it. Truthfully, I don't think the right moment for Apocalypse Zero to crack the US ever existed until now, but we'll get to that later. Because the anime is only 2 episodes long, and most people who saw it probably had no idea that it was even based on anything, it was never going to make much sense to an audience that didn't have access to the manga. In the mid-2000s, the manga market was booming, but ultra-violent batshit madness was stylistically on the way out, and Media Blasters was very far from being the biggest manga publisher. So let's get a little bit of perspective on the manga, Kakugo no Susume. It was serialized in the magazine Shukan Shonen Champion, meaning that it was aimed at an audience of teenage boys. This may be shocking if you're thinking about the imagery of the OVA and then comparing it to what American cartoons aimed at teens are like, but you really have to think about the comic book industry in the 90s, when edgy fare like Spawn was taking off and everyone's girlfriend was getting murdered and stuffed in a fridge, or the video rental market where teens were tricking their parents into buying them Tenchi Muyo because it's a cartoon, and then masturbating to the bath scenes. Shonen Champion also publishes Baki the Grappler, and I'm about to make a whole bunch of shit click in your head when I tell you that this OVA was directed by the same guy who directed the recent Netflix original Baki series, and now some of you probably see where I'm going with this. Champion also publishes Beastars, written by Baki's author's daughter, and Yowamushi Pedal, and formerly the likes of Blackjack, Cutie Honey, Jitsu wa Watashi wa, Magical Girl Apocalypse, Mitsuro Moe, Mai Hime, various Saint Seiya spin-offs, Shinryaku Ika Musume, and many others. If you know these works, you know this is just as varied as any other shonen magazine, even if it is fair to say that some of this magazine's works have always fallen into the extremely edgy side of the shonen spectrum. But it's also fair to say that other shonen magazines have simply gotten toned down compared to how they used to be. While Shonen Jump is still plenty violent and edgy from time to time, it's been a while since it was manically insane like when JoJo's Bizarre Adventure was published there. But that's what the landscape of shonen manga had been like in prior decades, and it probably would have had much more of a chance in the US at the time had manga really been a thing here. But really, it was only when the overwhelming influence of Dragon Ball, which hit Japan in the early 80s and America in the mid-90s, had rippled out to a generation of 20-something mangaka creating more upbeat and teen-friendly shonen action fare that the manga revolution would come to the US in the early 2000s. Meanwhile, Cartoon Network, WB, Fox, the internet, and a burgeoning DVD market were cultivating a larger, younger, and even more connected generation of anime anime fans outside of the previous culture. During this era, kids like me were absolutely terrified of most of those old turbo-violent OVAs, and the tastemakers of our time were hardly steering us into them. Many of the more serious anime fans who were forming careers around the medium and seeking to legitimize it as a mainstream form of entertainment had largely turned their noses up at a lot of the edgy old stuff that had caused their peers and parents to judge them for their interest in the medium, especially all of that raucous sexual violence. While there are titty monsters and giant cock weapons in Apocalypse Zero, I'd be really hesitant to describe its content as sexual. If you can handle JoJo, Baki, and Fist of the North Star, this is just that with relatively more outrageous monster designs, which is to say, it's just Devilman with a 90s coat of paint. It's not even close to being as dark and gritty as Berserk, which literally everyone loves, so let's not act like we're a bunch of babies about this shit today. Kakugo no Susume is a transforming hero show, a genre that's been prevalent in Japanese media for young people since the 60s in both anime and live action. While you could trace it to Devilman to a degree, and it's right alongside stuff like Guyver from the 80s and many ripples of that success into the late 90s like Generator Gall or The Soul Taker, the most obvious visual influence on the character is Kamen Rider, what with the bug eyes and awesome flowing cape. And let me just say, the fucking Zero suit is full stop one of the most badass power suit designs of all time. I am extremely tempted to buy this posable figure that I do not need at all. But the most unique thing about Kakugo no Susume isn't its insane violence, nor its absurd setting, nor its combination of genre tropes. All of those I just compared to other similar works. What separates Kakugo no Susume is, well, its resoluteness. So let's break that down. What immediately engrossed me from the first scene of this OVA was the terse and particular dialogue of Kakugo's father as he trains his two sons to fight monstrous creatures in the frozen tundra. It's immediately clear that these kids, while preposterously young to be doing stuff this crazy, have been trained from such an early age that they're already considerably more resilient and powerful than the majority of human beings. It's also shown that they are taught to dispatch their enemies as efficiently and dispassionately as possible, to the extent that when Kakugo's older brother Harada uses an unnecessary extra move to add flair to his kill, his father punches him in the face. This is our hint from the word go that Harada is harboring the tendencies of the Sith. Kakugo, on the other hand, is an iron wall of resolution, and if there's one design aspect for which I must praise Yamaguchi above even the awesome suit design, it's Kakugo's face. He really looks like the entire world has been sitting on his shoulders his entire life, but he's never imagined any purpose for himself beyond his usefulness, however limited it may turn out to be, in protecting the weak. There's not a single chink in his emotional armor, until he starts to have feelings for his intensely empathetic classmate Sumiko. Unfortunately, the OVA only gets as far as him having the thought that maybe he's starting to feel for her, and I already love that our hero doesn't falter in his self-awareness even in this regard where so many others would. What challenges this love would pose to him I would like to explore, and believe me, I'm tempted to scoop up those 6 manga volumes on the cheap, even though not even Scanslations have ever made it past volume 7. To get a little bit meta for just a moment, you are in the rant hole where I rant about whatever my $10, $20, and $30 patrons want me to rant about, and you can get one of these by being one of those. This one's for Kazuki, who says, "Watch and rant about Apocalypse Zero, the most insane shit I've ever seen. Also, this Mal review of it is great and pretty much captures my own thoughts and feelings on it." To quote a passage from the review, which mostly takes the approach that the OVA is worth watching for the sheer insanity of what's on display, there's this great scene where this giant fat mutant lady jealously kills some guy's girlfriend, and then she drags him back to her fat lady lair where she does indecent things to him before eating him. Anyway, later on the main character slays the fat lady and she pukes up the bones of all her victims, as well as the still digesting skinless body of the guy she just ate, and he's still alive. He has this, "Oh god, I have no skin, please kill me and end my suffering" look on his face, his skull anyway, and you expect the characters to put him out of his misery, right? No, the main girl painfully hugs the guy and goes, "Hang in there, you'll be okay." It took horse tranquilizers to get me to stop laughing. As an accidental black comedy, it doesn't get much better than this. I completely understand this reaction to the scene in question, and I'm glad that the reviewer enjoyed it, but to tell the truth, I had been kind of emotionally touched by this scene. After all, right from the start, I had to be keyed into the fact that, like so much of Japanese media, Kakugo no Susume heavily uses iconography associated with the bombings and nuclear fallout of Japan in World War II, super collided with the country's long history of being ravaged by natural disaster. As the dissolving boy crawls away from the pool of corpses vomited by the monster woman, he pleads for help while his body melts to the bone. Immediately I thought about the imagery of the bomb victims from Barefoot Gen. Like in that film, the other children are terrified of their former friend's shambling corpse, except for Sumiko, Sumiko, who fearlessly and tearfully embraces him. Later, after the monster is defeated, the kids are debating how they should deal with their classmate. Can they even safely touch him to bury him? But before they have time to form a plan, Kakugo goes ahead and sets his and all the other corpses ablaze, and in a tunnel of red light we see their souls ascending to the afterlife. As Sumiko clasps her hands in prayer, the school punk, floored by the terrors that have befallen his classmates, simply asks that his old friend rest in heaven and never return to this hell. In this scene, it is revealed that Kakugo no Susume really is a proper shonen manga with a heartfelt and positive message. The world is perilously awful, and people are going to try and take advantage of you and drain your life away from a young age. Because those forces are menacing and powerful, many, if not most of us, are going to fall prey to them. But as long as there is another force with an even more resolute desire to protect humanity, and as long as the human spirit shows itself to that hero to be worth protecting, then there remains some hope for humanity's future. Whether that hope is kept through to the end of the manga, I hope to get to learn eventually through reading it. I haven't yet discussed the biggest loose end left by this OVA, which is the rivalry of Kakugo and his older brother Harada. In their early teens, each of the well-trained children was made to fuse with a power suit containing the will and power of countless undead souls committed to protecting humanity by harnessing their bodies. In fusing with a female suit of armor, Harada ends up taking on a female body, despite continuing to identify as male. But something goes wrong. Whether it's the result of the flaws already apparent in Harada's personality, or something which became twisted in the mind of the armor itself, remains speculative at the point where the OVA ends. Whatever the case, when their father gives them the mission to go forth and protect the innocent, Harada concludes that humanity has collectively caused so much damage to innocent life on Earth that the only true way to protect the innocent is to eradicate humanity. His father believes that the human spirit is in fact the most noble that exists, but when their fists clash as their ideals, Harada murders his father and then attempts but unknowingly fails to murder his younger brother, possibly as a result of the same sloppy and showy fighting which his father had always admonished him for. So this is the central conflict of the show, a symbolically Luciferian character reaching the same conclusions about humanity that Lucifer himself did in Devilman, fighting a version of Devilman whom, instead of being thrust into the position unsuspectingly by his friend, has only ever had the mission of protecting humanity as an identity. In between them stands a legion of demon generals led by Harada for Kakugo to plow his way through. In the second episode, Kakugo first has to combat a run-of-the-mill thought, and then a run-of-the-mill boomer, who at one point shouts that the key to longevity is to kill the young. The time for Apocalypse Zero is right now. It's a time when, regardless of what the state of the world may be in comparison to how we've seen it in the past, young people are generally terrified and surrounded by unspeakable Lovecraftian horrors. If a blue baby man in an SS hat swinging his dick at people and screaming about how any threat to his identity, which itself is a threat to human safety, must die, isn't just begging for a bunch of blue checkmarks on Twitter to write think pieces about it in 2020, then nothing is. Mangaka Yamaguchi Takayuki is probably better known in America for the cult-beloved turbo-violent samurai seinen series Shigurui, which was stylistically adapted to anime by Madhouse in 2007 and directed by Hiroshi Hamasaki, who also handled Techno Lies, Steins Gate, and the excellent currently airing Blade of the Immortal adaptation. Yamaguchi's artwork is absurdly dense and detailed to an extent that could probably never be accurately adapted to animation on any long-term basis, but the OVA is, in my opinion, more than visually gratifying enough to justify itself. The angular, emotive character designs may be silly and kinda dated, but I still think they're cool and lovable and they suit the story well. The monster designs are unforgettable, and not just for being outrageous. It's one thing to just draw a big old dick monster, but the villains of Kakugo no Susume really feel like they could fill out the roster of a Yu-Gi-Oh card set. Depending on your personal benchmark for quality, your perspective on this OVA's animation will be different. If you're comparing it to the likes of the Patlabor or Gundam OVAs of the late 80s, it's not as consistent nor as detailed, as most things from the post-Crash 90s aren't. If you're comparing it to the average modern TV anime, the dynamic action, shot composition, and color design blow most way out of the water. I imagine that newer fans who have gotten used to extensive digital lighting and compositing and the softer look of modern character designs might see this as a linear downgrade from what they have today. But if you're someone who really digs into anime on a visual and aesthetic level, this OVA is going to at least satiate you, even if I might not pick it over something like X 1999, which came out that year, as something worth watching for the visuals alone. God, I love looking at that fucking movie. I would be completely fine with Kakugo no Susume continuing as an anime with as many of the OVA's aesthetic elements intact as possible. I'm sure it would be inevitably modernized and that the production's priorities would be shuffled if it were made today, but I can't imagine anywhere better to put it or any time better to release it than Netflix in the near future. We're living in a time where JoJo's Bizarre Adventure has finally started to crack the West with its anime adaptation like the manga had done in Japan in the 80s and 90s, where Berserk is widely regarded as the greatest manga of all time in Western circles. And Devilman was just given a slick Netflix reboot by Masaaki Yuasa that swept our popularity contests for Show of the Year. Not to mention Baki, as I said earlier, which ran in the same magazine and had a Netflix anime adaptation from the very same director who handled the OVA. Even if you got Hamasaki or Yuasa to direct, or even someone completely unexpected, as long as a competent studio handles it, I think this is a franchise ripe and ready for revival. It just starts with demand, and I demand you give it a shot. I also demand that if you like videos like this, you give me money on Patreon so I can keep making them. And make sure to check out all the other channels and projects and shit I'm doing in the description, like the Radcon 4 Kickstarter to fund my light novel about drinking my friend's piss and eating crack. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.